speakers today. One is Dr. Mittal. He is DM Cardiology from GV Pant Hospital, and he is the senior international cardiologist. He will speak on angiography versus CT angio, which is a very important topic in today's time. We had I had seen one video in one of the WhatsApp messages from Dr. Chajed, who is running Saul, and he was saying CT angio is the cheapest investigation, one should get it done. But I have my reservation on that, and I would like to hear Dr. Mittal what he has to say on this, because conventional angiography cannot be replaced in my mind. Thank you, sir. Dr. Mittal, please. I will not take much to thank you.
Very good evening to all the eminent doctors of Physician Forum of India. I am really delighted to be a part of this evening. I am Dr. Amit Mittal. I am a senior intervention cardiologist in Indraprasth Apollo Hospital. I had joined the Apollo Hospital in 2015. Before that, I was a faculty in GV Pant Hospital after completing my DM in 2009. So, the topic today, I think it's very much relevant in today's time, that whether we should go for a CT angiography or a conventional catheter angiography or invasive angiography, what we say, and how to decide which patients should be sent for CT and which should be sent for the invasive angiography. Though I didn't know much about this topic, I am here to learn from all the senior members of this forum only. And a little bit mistake of mine should be, I think, forgiven. I don't quote too much studies or any studies in this. It's my own personal view how we should decide about the CT or the invasive angiography. So, there are two types of imagings of the coronary artery. One is the anatomical imaging, another is the physiological imaging. Anatomical imaging will tell us about the anatomy of the coronary artery, the plaque, how much is the plaque, how we should quantify the plaque, but it didn't tell us about the physiological impact of that plaque or that stenosis. Means whether it is causing an angina or whether it is causing a disturbance to the flow of the blood in the coronary arteries. So anatomical imaging can be done by two methods. One is a CT coronary, another is a conventional invasive catheter angiography. Physiological imaging can be done by MPI or the SPECT scan, stress echocardiography or treadmill test. These tests do not directly image the coronary arteries. It will tell us about only the impact of the blockage. So previously I come on to the CT angiography only. So when it all started, it came with the EBCT or electron beam CT scan. With the electron beam CT scan, there is only provision to look for the calcification in the coronary arteries. Then came the multi-slice CT, which can actually look the coronary arteries. With the calcium scoring, there is some problem with the electron beam CT scan, that there is a decreased temporal as well as the spatial resolution. Spatial resolution means the distance covered with the EBCT is very high. So in between those two distances, if there is stenosis or if there is calcium, the EBCT tends to miss that. Same is with the temporal resolution, means the time resolution. If the heart is beating too fast, then the EBCT cannot detect the calcium of the coronary arteries. So with these two problems, to tackle this problem gives me multi-slice CT. Because the better temporal and spacious resolution EBCT is now replaced with the multi-slice CT. To appropriate image a coronary artery, a good temporal as well as the spacious resolution is required. Hence, for that, more than 64 slice CT, multi-slice CT is highly recommended. Nowadays, what's the recommendation for a good coronary imaging is ideally a 128 slice or 256 slice CT scan. So, in which patients CT coronary angiography is preferred over the conventional imaging angiography? Patients in which there is intermediate or low pre-test possibility. How to determine the pre-test possibility? That depends upon the age of the patient, the sex of the patient, the symptoms of the patient. So there are various scoring methods, but I won't go into the details of those. If we find that there is very less likelihood to find a stenosis in a patient, okay, like if it's less than 50% or 60%, better to go for a CT angiography. If we think that the chances of finding a significant stenosis is more than 60-70%, then better to go for a invasive catheter angiography. If the patient has negative or equivocal stress test, like if the patient comes to us with an equivocal treadmill test, or he didn't completed the treadmill test, but the symptoms are very persistent, then better to go for a CT angiography. Pre-surgical workup protocols, like in some surgical, like valve change surgeries, AVRs, MVRs, in which angiography is documented before surgical workup, especially in patients more than 40 years of age. In those cases, we can go for the CT coronary angiography. Then the patient preference is the upmost, which we generally find nowadays that the patient mostly comes and they themselves tell us that we don't want to go for the invasive angiography, go for the CT, we want to go for the CT angiography. In those patients, if it's a high pre-test possibility of more than 70%, or if the patient is diabetic, patient is having kidney disease, patient is very aged, or there is strong possibility of finding a high stenosis, if the patient is having treadmill strongly positive stress test, then better to convince the patient to go for an invasive angiography rather than going for the CT angiography. Then a triple rule out CT angiography in emergency department. It's ideally should be done in an emergency department, but still it's not available in India. Triple rule out CT if the patient comes to the emergency department with a chest pain and it's not very convincing for the acute coronary syndrome. And we find that we want to rule out pulmonary embolism, dissection or ACS. That it's a triple rule out CT in which we have to give a slightly more diet and it will rule out all the three things. It will do the pulmonary angiogram, it will do the coronary angiogram, it will do the autogram. So the patients in which conventional or invasive angiography is preferred. Again, high pre-test possibility of the coronary artery stenosis based on the symptoms or the positive stress test. Diabetic patient with the high chances of stenotic artery disease and high calcium load. I have personally seen in my practice that even if the diabetes is well controlled, it's the duration of the diabetes which is very important. If the duration of diabetes is more than 5 years, 7 years, generally we find a very heavy calcium score in the arteries. And beyond the calcium, the CT cannot see. So in those patients, I personally prefer to go for an invasive angiography, especially if the patient has significant symptoms or if the stress test is positive. Then again the patient preference. Some patients do prefer the invasive angiography over the CT angiography. When we tell them that this is the gold standard in your case compared to a CT angiography, they do prefer to go for, they say if we go for the CT angiography, again we have to do the conventional angiography if we want to go for the further intervention, so better to go for the invasive angiography. Acute coronary syndromes. Acute coronary syndromes is patient presenting with the unstable angina, non-ST elevation MI, ST elevation MI, markers positive, significant ECG changes, there is no role of CT angiography in those cases. Better to go for the invasive angiography. Non-CAD patient. or post PCI patient, post stent patient, it's better to go for the normal invasive angiography, because in stented patient there is generally a metal or the stent artifact, and beyond the stent the CT cannot see. So better to go for a invasive angiography. Advantages of coronary CT angiography: it's definitely an office or the IPD procedure, so we needn't admit the patient. It's one of the biggest advantage. Non-invasive, can detect other abnormalities or abnormal origin and anomalous origin of the coronary arteries. In many a times we see a patient persistently coming with a chest pain, his stress test is negative. Even if we do the regular routine angiography, invasive angiography, that is also normal. If we have an anomalous course of right coronary artery and it's going between the aorta and the pulmonary artery, whenever there is a heart contraction, because of that contraction the RCA gets buckled up between the pulmonary artery and the aorta, then that causes the angina of the patient. In those patients, the anomalous origin can be very well picked up by the CT coronary angiography. Can scan the thorax and mediastinum in the same study. Of the CT coronary angiography, one thing I like the most, that it has a very high negative predictive value of almost 99 to 100%. Means if it says that there is no blockage, the artery is absolutely clean, we should be clear in our mind that the arteries are absolutely clean. In emergency situation, triple rule out CT can effectively rule out these three things in a single scan, which is the biggest advantage of the CT coronary angiography if it's being done in our country. Then comes this another big advantage of the CT coronary angiography is its prognostic value. In an invasive angiography, one of the problem is we cannot prognosticate the patient in terms of the plaque morphology. Whether it's the plaque which can rupture later on and which can cause acute coronary syndrome, we cannot tell with the invasive angiography. It's with the CT coronary angiography we can tell about the prognostic value. In addition to the lesion location and stenosis severity, plaque composition and morphology can be further enhance the prognostic yield. In the CT angiography, we can definitely tell if the patient has a lipid-rich plaque with a thin myocardium over that plaque. If that plaque is lipid-rich with a thin myocardial cap, it means it can burst anytime and it has a very high prognostic value to cause the ACS in that patient. Can identify non-stenotic plaques which may be undetected by the conventional angiography. What we mean by the non-stenotic plaques? Non-stenotic plaques is, in some of the patients, instead of growing inward towards the lumen of the artery, the plaque grows towards the outside, towards the adventitia of the coronary artery. So those plaques can be missed in the conventional invasive angiography and can be picked up in the CT coronary angiography. And if we look at these non-stenotic plaques, again, if they have a high lipid content and a very thin myocardium over them, then those plaques can burst and can cause the acute coronary syndrome. So it is seen that CT coronary angiography has been closely associated with a future cardiovascular event, with only 0 to 1% of the cardiac event being reported in patients with a normal cardiac CT or mild coronary artery disease, and up to 30% in patients with one or more vessels causing obstructive CAD. So the prognostic value is very high with the CT coronary angiography. Then the plaque composition, as I have already told, that if it's a lipid-rich plaque with a thin myocardium, that plaque composition can predict the future cardiovascular events. The presence of high-risk plaque, which I will come in the next slide, that if the plaque shows a positive remodeling means if it is growing towards the outside wall, adventitia of the vessel, low CT attenuation value, napkin ring size, sign, or a spotty calcification. These all things are associated with the increased risk of the major cardiac event later on in the patient. So positive remodeling is seen in the early stage of the coronary plaque formation and known to be closely related with the plaque instability. This is the positive remodeling we can see. Here the plaque is growing towards the outside. So if in the CT it's defined as if the outer vessel diameter, this is the larger yellow line, if it is more than 10% of the mean diameter of the segment immediately proximal or distal to the plaque. It means a positive remodeling is there, and these patients have a very high likelihood of the future event, and we need to prognosticate them and start the early lifestyle changes, early statins and all those things. Therefore, positive vascular remodeling and plaque composition can be used as a guide for patient management and risk factor modification for the asymptomatic young patients. Other signs which we can see in the CT is the low attenuation plaque, defined as the focal central area of plaque with the attenuation density. As we can see that the attenuation density of this area is comparatively high. This is a very low area of low attenuation, and this plaque is highly vulnerable to be ruptured in the near future. Spotty calcification, napkin ring sign. Napkin ring sign means an area of low attenuation followed by a high attenuation area surrounding that. So this is a low attenuation area followed by a high attenuation area. These all signs are suggestive of a very high likelihood of the future event. These findings remind us of, although the functional tests attempt to detect the flow limiting CAD, means the functional test means treadmill test, the echocardiography, stress echocardiography, but those can tell us about only the physiological significance of that stenosis. That cannot tell us about the vulnerability of that plaque, which only the CT can tell us. Like we can see in this picture, this is a normal coronary with a normal SPECT scan. This is a diffuse non-obstructive, there is a diffuse blockage here and there. This is also having a normal SPECT scan. Again, this patient is having a positive remodeling, the plaque is growing towards the outside. This patient is also having a normal SPECT scan because these lesions are not physiologically significant. They are not causing any obstruction to the flow of the coronary arteries. But these can predict the future event in the patient if we do the CT angiography. Diagnostic accuracy of the CT coronary angiography. It has a very high diagnostic value. It's particularly negative predictive value of almost 100% with a diagnostic accuracy of 95% was achieved with the 256 light CT for detecting a more than 50% coronary stenosis. What are the disadvantages of CT coronary angiography? Till now we have seen the advantages only. What are the disadvantages? Higher radiation exposure compared to the invasive angiography. Previously it was seen and it was like talk in many of the journals that there is increased cancer risk in the patients with the CT coronary angiography because of the high radiation exposure. But now it is seen that if we do the ECG gating can be prospective or the retrospective gating. With the retrospective gating, the radiation exposure is high compared to the prospective gating. If we do the prospective ECG gating in the CT coronary angiography, we can reduce the radiation dose in the patients. More contrast volume is needed compared to coronary angiography. In invasive coronary angiography, we can, with our preferences, we can do with the minimum of the dye. We can do with the 15 ml dye, we can do with the 20 ml dye, take the necessary projections only, and we can skip the unnecessary projection. But in the CT coronary angiography, we have to give a fixed amount of contrast. We cannot change the volume of the contrast. So if the patient has borderline CKD or borderline kidney function derangement, in those patients we cannot change the contrast volume, and there are high chances of going into the contrast nephropathy in the patients of going for the CT coronary angiography. A strict heart rate control is needed for the good imaging in the CT coronary angiography. Whenever we send the patient for a CT coronary angiography, generally the lab tells us to maintain the patient's heart rate between 60 and 70 for the good imaging. While this is not in the case with the catheter angiography. Even at the rate of 120, 150, we can get as good the image in the normal invasive angiography. In the obese patient, poor imaging quality, high calcium score. Whenever I send the patient for a CT angiography, I ask the radiologist over there to do the calcium scoring only. If the calcium score is more than 400, I ask him not to give the contrast to that patient, because any calcium score more than 400 will limit the actual plaque composition or plaque formation below the calcium. So better to skip in the high calcium zone. CT coronary angiography. Post-stent patient, not a good modality. Low positive predictive value to quantify the coronary stenosis compared to coronary invasive coronary angiography. Positive predictive value is less. In many a patient we have seen if the quantification of the CT coronary angiography is wrong. Like if we say that CT says it's 60% stenosis, in the normal angiography we find it's a 90% stenosis. If CT says it's a 90% stenosis, normal angiography we say it's a 10%. Small vessel and collateral we cannot see with the CT coronary angiography. CT or catheter angiography in a post-CABG patient, it's a very good modality. In a post-CABG patient, CT coronary angiography is a very good modality to look for the grafts. But looking for the native vessels, it's not a very good modality in a post-CABG patient because of the high calcium load, because of the thin vessels, because of the poor outflow. So if we want to go for some intervention in the patient, better to go for the invasive angiography in the post-CABG patient. Again, in the post-PDCA patient, because of the stent artifact, invasive angiography is considered better compared to the CT angiography. Like this is a stented patient, there is a stent artifact and we cannot see beyond that stent artifact if there is stenosis inside the stent. Again, it's very difficult to see inside the stent. So one frequent point mentioned against the use of CT coronary angiography is the fact that CT is being a purely anatomical imaging modality cannot establish the hemodynamic relevance of the coronary artery lesion and therefore has similar limitation as the invasive angiography. But the prognostic value of the CT is more compared to the invasive angiography. Although this is absolutely true, but again does not prevent the CT angiography from being clinically useful if the aim is to rule out the coronary artery stenosis to demonstrate the absence. Means if you want to look for the negative part of the CT coronary angiography, it's a very good modality. Critics are often based on the less than perfect positive predictive value of the CT coronary angiography. It's absolutely true that CT has a tendency towards overestimation of the stenosis degree and artifacts can mimic the stenosis. So the positive predictive value is lower when we want to be what we want to be. Means positive predictive value is not as high in the case of the CTs. So if CT coronary angiography is screening tool for coronary artery disease, if we go for the screening, we can pick up very high false positive lesions and too many stenosis that actually we didn't need to find out, and so we shouldn't lower the threshold for the CT coronary angiography too much. Means we shouldn't send for the each and every patient to rule out the coronary artery disease to the CT angiography, as Dr. Gupta has already pointed out. The method is ideally suited to rule out the disease in patients with the lower spectrum of the pretext likelihood and would otherwise be considered for the other form of testing, including invasive angiography. Application outside this comfort zone may be justified in a single case, but in general should be avoided and cautioned not to use CT angiography in high-risk population where it has little to contribute. So, finally, a summary: multi-slice CT is not likely to replace the conventional angiography in the current time. Major strength of the CT is its high negative predictive value and it's an OPD procedure. Major disadvantage is the strict heart rate control, more radiation exposure and low sensitivity in accurately quantifying the degree of stenosis. All modalities are improving. No single modality fit all application and all patient. Choice of initial test depends upon the specific clinical question in the individual patient. So it's about finding the right test for the right person at the right time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amit Mittal. You are very nice and very clear-cut distinguish between CT and conventional angiography. We will have question answer after both the talks. And now we have a talk on endoscopy from Dr. Yogesh, who is a very senior gastroenterologist, and let us hear from you what he has to say on the endoscopy and its implications. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. It's been a long time since we interacted with the Physician Forum. I am really grateful to the forum because I had actually launched my career at Apollo with the Physician Forum. That was a good 3 years ago. Dr. Chauhan, Dr. Gupta, Dr. Poddar, Dr. Mangla and all senior colleagues and friends, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I would be talking today about endoscopy, the past, present and future of endoscopy. So when endoscopy started, this is what it used to be like. I mean, it was like that magic trick जिसमें patient के गर्दन ऊपर करके and the sword used to be put inside. Gradually things evolved. A flexible endoscope was developed. This endoscope had a flexible tube which could then be inserted into the esophagus under direct vision. The flexible tube improved further, and Herkovitz in 1957 was credited to develop the first flexible endoscope. Then came the era of the video endoscope. This came in 1992. So endoscopy is not all that old. I mean, this is how you see endoscopy today. And today we have a plethora of endoscopes. So we have the simple upper GI endoscopy. So normally जब हम endoscopy की बात करते हैं, we are talking about upper GI endoscopy. We also talk about colonoscopy, but now there are a number of specialized scopes like the ultra thin scope, which is a scope which can be inserted through the nose, or it can be inserted through very narrow esophageal strictures. The enteroscope, which can go into the small bowel, so much so that there is a motorized enteroscope now which can actually be inserted from the mouth and go right up to the cecum. ERCP, which we all know and we were just talking about some time ago. Cholangioscope. So cholangioscope is another recent advance in which through the ERCP scope you put in another scope, which something which is very close to my heart is endoscopic ultrasound. So we endoscopists do a lot of things like coin removal. You can see this particular foreign body, which is actually a coin, being caught with a rat tooth forceps and being brought out. This was a patient referred a long time ago from one of the hospitals in the city, saying that there was a tumor within the esophagus, which actually turned out to be a denture. This tumor had led to a fistula from the esophagus to the lung. There were hooks in this denture which were attaching to the esophagus and through which there was a leak which was happening, leading to a pleural effusion. This was again caught with the forceps and gradually brought out. The patient said कि मेरा दांत खो गया था, लेकिन कब खोया था मुझे याद नहीं. So it actually swallowed it without even remembering. So we were able to bring this out, and after bringing this out, we could see that there was a hole in the esophageal wall. And to seal this hole, we put in a covered metallic stent above this. So this is a wire which is going inside, and this is a metallic stent which is being put. So once the metallic stent was put, the hole was actually sealed, and after a month, the stent could be removed without any sign of the fistula. The pleural effusion disappeared completely. So somebody who came in with a diagnosis of a tumor turned out to be a benign disease and could be taken care of fully by endoscopy. This is this is polypectomy being done. So this is a large polyp which is being snared. This polyp has a peduncle here. Similarly, this is a large polyp which could not be removed with a single polypectomy session. So this has to be removed piecemeal. So here you can see the snare being applied across the polyp, and the polyp is now being got and being removed. Actually, an endoloop has been put before doing a polypectomy, and this kind of polypectomy takes hours together, and you go on removing till you are able to, you see this now is the complete polyp which has been taken off and is being brought out by a opponent. Probably the most dangerous things that we do in endoscopy is managing bleeders. And when we talk about managing bleeders, is this kind of stuff. So this is a torrential hemorrhage which is happening from an endoscopic varices in a patient with cirrhosis. And you see a EST, endoscopic sclerotherapy being done, and you can see that the bleeding has stopped completely. This other patient, on the other hand, was someone who I treated 3 years back. He had come in night on a cold winter morning. I was asked to do endoscopy, and the moment I applied the clip, there was like Ganga, Jamna, Saraswati, and he exsanguinating right in front of me. BP went down to 50/40 systolic. We were lucky that he could be taken up to the OT directly, and in the OT they did a salvage surgery. They ligated the duodenal artery and found that actually there was a lymphoma which was eroding into the duodenum. So probably one should not have put in those clips that we did at that time. Coming to ERCP, this is what you keep hearing about when you talk about ERCP, that this is the ampulla, the papilla ovata. This is the cannula which is gone inside, and the cut which is being made. And once this cut has been made, access is provided, and then you can do a lot of things. You can enter the bile duct, you can enter the pancreatic duct, and you can bring out things like stones, you can stent tumors. You see a stone just came out of the ampulla. Newer things which has happened, and this is a spyglass. So spyglass is something which is being made by Boston Scientific, and so this is a long video. I will try to So spyglass is something which goes through the ERCP scope, and this is what the spyglass looks like. It is like a standard conventional endoscope. It has facilities for all the biopsy channels. It goes through the side hole of the ERCP scope and actually attaches on the ERCP scope. You see the sky scope is now entering the ERCP scope. The scope size is not even 3 millimeters. This is the ERCP scope which is now coming to the ampulla, through which the spice scope is inserted, and this then can either go into the bile duct. You can directly visualize the bile duct. The bile duct can be cleaned of debris, biopsies taken, and if there is any stricture that can be taken care of. If there is a stone, it can actually be broken with laser or electrohydraulic lithotripsy. This is a tumor that you see, and biopsies can be taken with this. This is a stone which was being broken. Similarly, the spyglass can also enter into the pancreatic duct, and this is a pancreatic tumor which is being biopsied with a spyglass. So that was about spyglass. Coming over to stenting. So the next major advance which happened in endoscopy was stenting. Stenting can happen in various places. So you can stent the esophagus, you can stent the biliary tree, you can stent the large intestine or the colon, you can stent the duodenum, or you can stent the bile duct or pancreatic duct. Coming to esophageal stenting, as I have shown you in the first slide, esophageal stenting is usually done in esophageal cancers. So this is a esophageal cancer, and post-radiation there was this hole within the esophagus which is leading to leakage of all the food into the body. So once we apply a covered stent, this hole is sealed and this perforation can actually be closed. There are multiple studies on this, and this has been shown to be very, very effective. This is now a stent which is being deployed, and this is a completely deployed stent. Colonic stenting. So this is a large CA colon. Again, a similar assembly which has gone through the CA colon. A wire which is going through the cancer. See, this patient presented with acute obstruction. So the choice in this situation is that either you do a surgery first, which means that you do a colostomy. You bring out one part of the colon to the skin, let the tissue, let the colon become contracted again, and then do a resectional surgery. Or you do this kind of a stenting, and once you place the stent, the colon gets decompressed, and after decompression you can actually do a laparoscopic surgery immediately the next day after this decompression. So the stent is now being deployed, and as the stent is being deployed, a gush of fecal matter would start coming out. You can see some of it here. So this is a patient who's in pain, is completely distended, is very, very miserable. And you put in a stent, and 5 minutes later all the distension, the pain goes away, he starts passing stool. It's like a miracle for him. He becomes so grateful that this procedure could have been done. Coming to biliary stenting. Biliary stenting is done by a ERCP. This is again a ERCP cannula being inserted into the bile duct. You can see that there is an obstruction there, a papillotomy being done. So this kind of stenting can be done in benign diseases or malignant diseases. Benign diseases are benign biliary stricture, leaks, stones, cholecystitis, bleeding or perforation. While malignant diseases are CA gallbladder, CA pancreas, cholangiocarcinoma or peripancreatic carcinoma. See, once the stent is deployed, you can see the thick black bile which is coming out. Normally, the bile color is golden. So this kind of black bile is infected bile, and this infection would resolve rapidly with the placement of these kind of metallic stents. Stents are also used to seal perforation. So this is something which I had created during the endoscopic ultrasound being done a long time ago. Endoscopic ultrasound has a beak. So once going into the duodenum, it went through. So once it went through, the choice was either to send the patient for surgery or to put in a stent to cover this. So if stenting is done before peritoneal contamination sets in, you can get away without surgery. So this stent was put over this perforation. You can see the stent going here. And once fully deployed, the patient could start eating 2 days after the stenting. And after about a month, the stent could be removed. The perforation had sealed completely. So basically, you can avoid surgeries in early perforations once you stent, or you can actually clip also. Another advance which has happened in endoscopy and probably has been a game changer in endoscopy is endoscopic ultrasound. So there are 2 kinds of endoscopic ultrasound scopes. One is the radial scope, which has an ultrasound transducer at a 360 degrees. The other is a linear scope, in which we can do procedures, we can do therapeutic work, in which the transducer is like this at 90 degrees, and there is a biopsy channel through which biopsy implements, stents, needles can come out in the view of the endoscopic ultrasound. The indications would be therapeutic, which would need drainage procedures like pseudocysts, abscesses, hepatic abscesses, biliomas, gallbladder drainage and pelvic abscesses. Needle-guided injections like cystic lesions of pancreas, GIST, insulinoma, hepatic metastasis, pancreatic adenocarcinoma, brachytherapy and oncogel. So if you look at these indications, a lot of them would have previously gone to surgery. So essentially, endoscopic ultrasound is taking away a lot of work from the surgeons. We also do tissue ablation, celiac plexus block and cholangiopancreatography. These are the endoscopic ultrasound needles. So this is a 24G needle, 22 and a 19G needle. The 19G needle is actually a biopsy needle and you get tissue which is equivalent to a biopsy. This is a video which is showing a large mediastinal lymph node. So before the advent of the endoscopic ultrasounds, the mediastinum could only be accessed by either opening the chest or doing a VATS. With endoscopic ultrasound, you can access these kind of muscles. You can see this is the heart actually. So this is the left atrium and this is the pulmonary artery, and this is the needle which is coming out into the lymph node and taking samples. So nodes as small as 0.5 millimeters can actually be accessed through this modality. We have facilities for pathology on site, so it is like a frozen section. You sample a node and you get a report immediately as to what is the nature of this. Quick staining is done, and these are the kind of specimens that you get. These are the classical slipper-shaped cells that we see in a granuloma in tuberculosis. This is a pancreatic adenocarcinoma, large cell with nuclear this thing. This is celiac plexus neurolysis. So the celiac ganglion, which is around the celiac artery, is responsible for transmitting pain. So if you are able to inject alcohol into the celiac ganglion, you are able to resolve pain in patients of malignancy. And this is how this procedure is done. So this is the aorta, this is the celiac artery coming out, and this is the superior mesenteric artery. So celiac ganglion is located here. This is a needle, and through this needle you can inject first bupivacaine, which is an anesthetic, and after that absolute alcohol. Another procedure which has taken away a lot of work from the surgeons, this is a large pancreatic pseudocyst which forms after acute pancreatitis. You can see a needle being inserted and a wire being called within the pseudocyst. This is a special kind of a stent which is being put, and this is the stent being opened on the luminal side. So as the stent opens, all the fluid which is inside the pseudocyst comes out into the stomach. But the beauty of this procedure is that it does not end here. It does not just remove the fluid. This stent is about 1.5 to 2 centimeters in diameter. See, this is the open stent and all the muck is coming out. So this is a large stent and you can actually go inside after 2 days into the pseudocyst and remove the leftover necrotic material and do what is known as a necrosectomy. So this is how you access the bile duct by endoscopic ultrasound. Either you can access it through the liver or you can access it through the bile duct itself. So EOS guided biliary interventions can be EOS guided access, which means a rendezvous, which means that you pass in a wire which comes into the duodenum and you catch it with the ERCP scope. Or you can do drainage, which can be antegrade drainage, which means you pass in a wire which comes here and then you push in a stent on top of the wire. Or it could be transmural drainage, which means that you could do a EOS guided cholecystectomy duodenostomy, putting in a stent here, or a hepaticogastrostomy, putting in a stent here. This is the antegrade stenting, which I did a long time ago. So this is a needle, and you can see the bile duct being completely opacified, a wire being passed into the duodenum and dye now into the duodenum, a stent being placed into the duodenum, and then this is a fully deployed stent across the biliary structure. This is hepaticogastrostomy being done. So this is a needle which is coming out into the biliary duct through the liver. All this is happening through the liver. This needle tract needs to be dilated. And after dilatation, a stent is put which is communicating with the liver on one hand and the stomach on the other. You can see the free flow of bile which is coming out. Obviously, the risk in both these procedures is that you can cause a bile leak. So in times to come, instead of what you traditionally see in patients who have undergone stenting, you will see pictures like this when the left duct would be stented between the liver and the stomach, and the right duct would be stented between the duodenum and the liver, and maybe 2 stents would be deployed, one in the right anterior, the other in the right posterior. So right anterior, right posterior and left duct. Gallbladder stenting. So this is, I believe Dr. Podar is the only surgeon in the room, so I don't have to face much criticism here. But this is probably what is going to be the future of cholecystectomy. So you can see that with the similar lamps, lumen opposing stent which is being deployed into the gallbladder, you can actually go through this and remove the gallstones. So we have started doing this in patients who are unfit for surgery, but a time might come when you might not need a cholecystectomy except in gallbladders which are completely contracted. These are fundal varices which form into the fundus of the stomach in patients who have cirrhosis. And we used to put in lots of glue to inject these varices, which led to glue embolization. But now you can put in coils inside these varices, and once there is a scaffold of the coil, you can put in small amounts of glue, and 2 ml, 3 ml is sufficient even to take care of large varices. This is glue, this is the coil which is coming out. So the small bowel has always been an area which has been dark for both the gastroenterologist as well as the radiologist. We have never been able to figure out how to image the small bowel. Lot of advances in imaging, MR angiography, CT angiography, but never really came up to the mark till this instrument came, which is known as the capsule endoscopy. So this is like a small pill which you swallow, and once you swallow, it goes down the intestine, sending out light and recording images. These images are transmitted to a recorder which is by the side of the patient, and this recording is collected over 24 hours and then analyzed and gives you image like this. So things like this is how the image looks like. Things like obscure GI bleeds can be identified and taken care of. So this is a capsule image, and you can see that this image, you can see this is a bleeding point. And these images are as clear as any endoscopic image. So this has led to an increased detection of things like Crohn's disease, ulcers in the small intestine, obscure GI bleed, pill enteritis. The problem is that these capsules can get stuck, and in a way it resolves the problem, because once the capsule is stuck, you have to resort to surgery. Then came the endoscope, a specific endoscope to go into the small bowel. So this is a double balloon enteroscope. It has two balloons, and these two balloons can anchor the small bowel, and the scope goes on going inside, and it is like pleating, जैसे नाड़ा चढ़ाते हैं उस तरह से, and it goes right up to the ileum. But this again was insufficient. So another advance has been the spiral endoscope. So this has a motorized spiral. We did a workshop recently and some interesting things we picked up. Like this was a young boy who had pain abdomen, and we picked up a Meckel's diverticulum of all the things by a spiral endoscopy. Chroma endoscopy I would skip for lack of time and go straight to ESD and AMR. So this is third space endoscopy. So the first space is the lumen, the second space is the peritoneum, where the surgeons deal with. Between the lumen and the peritoneum is the wall. So now endoscopists are entering into the wall, which is the third space endoscopy. So this is a small tumor which is being resected. This technique is known as EMR. So you inject saline below this tumor, and as our dietary patterns are changing, we are seeing a lot of these luminal tumors, which can be then lifted and resected. So we are resecting below the mucosa into the third space. See, you can lift the entire tumor. So early gastric cancers, early colonic cancers can be dealt with now with endoscopy. You do not need surgery for them, even if they are very large in size. Barrett's esophagus can be dealt with them like this. So this is EMR, and ESD means that you cut this entire mucosa and then go on dissecting the mucosa and remove the tumor completely. The defect that you see below the mucosa is the muscle, and then you close this by application of clips. This is ESD. So this is a tumor. You mark the tumor by these marks, and then you raise the bleb, and then you join all these dots, and these are the kind of defects which are being created, which are finally sutured with clips. So clipping is like the suturing that surgeons used to do. This is the famous poems, which is very, very fashionable these days. So this is done by achalasia cardia. You tunnel between the wall of the esophagus, reach the G junction, and you cut this muscle from here to here, the distal 8-10 centimeters, and then again close the defect by application of multiple clips. Metabolic endoscopy. Metabolic endoscopy, obesity is now an epidemic in our society, and endoscopy is also coming up to take care of obesity. So these are the various kind of gastric balloons which are available. So a gastric balloon which does not actually need the endoscopy is now available, and you can simply swallow the balloon. Maybe if the patient is unable to do it, you can push the balloon behind with the endoscope. These are other devices. This is a full sense device which is like a stent, and it attaches to the cardia, gives a sense of satiety. This is a very, very strange device which only Americans could adapt. This is like a peg tube. It is a tube within the stomach. And like the great Romans used to induce vomiting, you're supposed to go to the toilet after 2 hours and empty out the gastric contents into the bottle here and throw it away. So eat as much as you want, go empty the bottle and go on eating. So you can continue to eat and continue to discard. So endoscopy is now not just endoscopy. Endoscopy is probably going to be surgery in future, and this is what is known as notes. Again a very long video. So what you are seeing is the gallbladder being brought out from the mouth of the patient. So how does notes work? I will rush through the video. So the operator goes inside, applies these clips and then makes an incision between the clips. Create a hole here, and through this hole the balloon dilatation is done to make the hole large enough so that the scope can come into the peritoneum. The scope is now on the peritoneal side. This is actually the peritoneum that you are seeing. You can see the CBD, the common bile duct, which is being dissected, isolated. These are sutures being applied to hold the bile duct, and in between the bile duct would be cut, or the cystic duct would be cut. I am very sorry. The cystic duct would be cut. And then finally, the gallbladder is brought out into the stomach, the defect closed, and in the end you see the gallbladder coming out of the endoscope through the mouth of the patient. So this can actually be done through the rectum, through the vaginal wall, and through the stomach. More of surgery, so endoscopic bariatric surgery, ESGE, which is a reality, we are doing it in Apollo, which means that you don't need to do a sleeve gastrectomy or a bypass. You can go into the lumen and you can make circular sutures to tighten the lumen of the stomach completely. Thank you very much for a patient listening. I hope I did not really डॉक्टर तुलसी से मुझे बड़ा डर लगता है.
अभी तो लाइट ऑन करो, लाइट to ask questions. Just to light on करो, yeah. We have come to the end of our and now I will invite the audience to ask questions. Dr. Langa, Dr. Mittal will reply. And it was a very excellent talk, Dr. Lata. You have told us so many uses of endoscopy in GIT disorders, in CA, in all sort of things. Thank you very much for giving us all the information. And I would like some of us, Dr. Tulsi, to ask some of the questions. Don't ask very difficult questions.
DM final में इतना डर नहीं लगता मेरे को. जैसे तुलसी मुझे दिखाई देता है ना, तो I actually start shivering.
Yes, sir.
Great talk, sir.
Thank you, sir.
So, when you were referring to the CT angio, were you talking about the UHR? The ultra high resolution CT, because the recent CTs UHR are at least 2.5 times more spatial resolutions than they were earlier. So, were you talking about that, the ultra high resolution?
Sir, definitely what's available in our country and most commonly available in bigger center is the 256 slice CT. I haven't seen a coronary imaging done on higher than a 256 slice CT. So if we called it as a high ultra speed CT, then we can definitely say that 256 slice CT is the maximum which is available, and it has got a very high spatial as well as the temporal resolution. So even in some centers, even at the heart rate of 80-85, they can have a very good imaging. But still, to have a very fine imaging, we still ask the patient to be in the heart rate between 60 to 70.
Right. So some concerns that you talked about, especially in heavily calcified lesions. So this is not the modality of choice. But recently it has received class 1 recommendations for diagnosing symptomatic CAD. What do you say about that?
Sir, it is said that higher is the calcium score in the patient, there is a high likelihood of finding a stenosis in the patient.
Right.
So whatever is the calcium score of the patient, that also actually predict the severity of the stenosis, also to finding a stenosis in those patients. But to quantify that stenosis beyond the calcium where there is calcium in the coronary artery, we cannot actually quantify that stenosis, how much is the stenosis, whether it's 50%, 60%, because CT cannot penetrate through that calcium to look at the lesion directly.
Right. So absolute contraindications would be what? Drug, ionized dye reactions, allergy towards that. What about decompensated heart failure? And what else? Probably, you have to have a scan protocol where the patient can hold himself and go through this. And acute MIs, of course, you can't do it. Patients who are hemodynamically unstable, you can't have that. Can we have some silence, please?
Sir, so the absolute contraindications, definitely ACS is an absolute contraindication to go for a CT. The patient which cannot hold the breath, as you have told that. Otherwise, even in the CT scans which we are doing nowadays in most of the centers, the breath holding time is hardly 10 to 15 seconds, not more than that. So if the patient can hold the breath for 10 to 15 seconds, he can go for a CT scan. In my view, if the patient needs, if I personally feel that if the patient needs if the patient has very high likelihood of finding a stenosis, like if the pretext value is very high of finding the stenosis, I do the CT angiography. Again, he has to go for a conventional angiography to go for further procedure, whether it's a PTCA or whether it's a bypass surgery. Because most of the surgeons are not comfortable with the CT angiogram. They would like to have an invasive angiogram before doing a bypass surgery. So in those patients, I will definitely like to order for an invasive angiogram.
Right, Dr. Batra, what a pleasure to listen to you again. And so we talked about the capsule endoscopy. Steve, previously it was only reserved for probably looking into the small bowel. But now I believe it's being looked, entire GI tract. You're diagnosing Crohn's disease, prognostifying Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel diseases, tumors in the small intestines, and whatnot with capsule endoscopy. And now the lighter versions are available. And it takes about 50 to 60,000 images. How costly is the capsule endoscopy, sir?
About ₹1 lakh.
₹1 lakh. It's worth it. Would you say it's worth it? Right.
Because the small bowel is still a very, very dark area, and capsule leads to a whole lot of changes in diagnosis. Again, on the lighter side, we at times find things like Vocon's diagnosed on capsule in patients with obscure AIT. So that was quite silly to go in for capsule for this diagnosis. But then we do end up having a yield of at least 30 to 40%.
Any drawbacks, Dr. Batra? For example, in patients who have cardiac devices, probably would the electromagnetic fields would interfere
No,
in this?
no, they don't. They don't. But the biggest drawback is that whatever you do, you cannot predict the stricture.
Right.
So all imaging modalities do not predict the stricture, and you end up having the capsule stuck at least 20 to 30%.
Your talk about the EUS, it's a game changer, the way you are treating now, biliary, pancreatic problems, drainage of the abscesses, putting stents there, it's a game changer, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions there?
Do you have anything to do with empty perforation endoscopically?
No, we can't. We can't because there is a lot of inflammation in these perforations, and perforations which have a lot of inflammation and edema cannot be closed with clips. Clips would not hold.
In one of your slides, you said there was a perforation.
Yeah, so this has to be closed immediately. You see the work happening. It's an endoscopically induced work in front of your own eye. So before infection and edema sets in, you have to close.
Sir, I would like to know more about rigid endoscopy, which we ENT people used to do earlier. But my gathering is that sometimes the endoscopist is stuck with the flexible endoscope because it's difficult to dislodge. Foreign body can be stuck in the esophagus, very difficult to remove. Then we are caught, the ENT people, with the rigid endoscopy. Do you have the backup straight away? Generally. Second part is, there are two incidents which come to my mind, anecdotes of course. One was that my dear friend IPS Kalra, he called me once in emergency that Parashar Sujan Mehndar mein there is a patient I am stuck with for the last 3 hours. It is not coming out some foreign body in the esophagus. I stay nearby, so I went with my scope. Within 15 minutes we were able to dislodge what was actually a transparent denture. So transparent dentures sometimes are not visible to the flexible endoscopy, and you can't see the edge, so you can't pull it out. A similar thing happened when we were stuck in Asian hospital. The lady forgot that she had got dentures, and dentures somehow got dislodged, and she ingested it without knowing it, and then landed up with the blockage between the chest and everything. It was eventually diagnosed with the CT scan and all that there is a denture over there. Despite all the efforts with the flexible as well as rigid, we were not able to move it, take out, because it was so much of clenching everywhere. It was partial denture actually. So we had to open the neck, then gain access, because other option was to do the open chest. We wanted to avoid mediastinitis and open chest, so we opened the neck over here, went into the cervical esophagus. From there we were able to hold it. We even had to call a urologist to hold with the better instruments so that we could dislodge it and take it out. So I mean, these are things which teach us more.
No, dentures are very, very difficult, but the basic problem is that dentures have hooks. And if the patient forgets, these hooks tend to invade into the esophageal mucosa. And then dislodging them becomes very, very difficult. So you have to be careful that you go to the hook, dislodge the hook on one side, then on the other side, and then hold the denture and bring it up.
I once took out a Ma Durga locket. Mother was wearing, I grabbed it, and now the share has got 4 limbs and the mother has got four arms. So everything was getting into the esophagus and had to be very gently dislodged so that there is no...
That's a huge problem.
Dr. Mangla,
I wanted to ask the cardiologist, Dr. Mittal, regarding diabetic patients. You see, these patients have, you don't know what is the status of their kidneys. Till what level of creatinine do you go in for the CT coronary angios? Because if there something comes, then you again have to do an interventional procedure, and again they need a contrast. And how often they will end up with AKI?
Sir, generally what is seen is I myself took a upper limit of 1.5 creatinine, asked the patient to hydrate well for 2 days, gave him an acetylcysteine, then go for the CT angiography. But if it's a very high pretext possibility, like if the patient is having very symptomatic for angina or the stress test is strongly positive, the patient is long-term diabetic, like almost 10 years diabetic, then I will ask him to go for the invasive angiography directly rather than going for the CT angiography. Because in the invasive angiography we can manipulate the dye, we can take half contrast, half saline, and we can do with that small amount of saline, even with a 15 ml of this thing contrast, we can do the full angiography in a diabetic patient. While in CT angiography, we have to give the full contrast to the patient. So the upper cutoff limit from my side is 1.5 creatinine, not more than that.
And how often even in catheter angiography with 1.5 or 1.6 creatinine do they end up with AKI or amurate?
Sir, till date, I haven't seen a single patient. Till date, I haven't seen a single. Even with the 6.4 of creatinine, I have done the invasive angiography and PTC, and the patient is in cardiorenal syndrome. Within 1.5 months, he is having absolutely normal urea creatinine because the heart has recovered very well, and so is the kidneys.
Thank you.
Dr. Amit, sir, just an extension of Dr. Mangla's question.
Yes, sir.
Many of our diabetic patients, they are already on metformin. So, I'm not talking of any creatinine level, maybe the creatinine is normal. What is the standard recommendation for these patients, suppose they want to go in for a CT angiography? Should we take out metformin, stop metformin before we go in for contrast CT?
So as such, there is no recommendation to stop the metformin before going for the CT angiography. We didn't stop any medication, just a strict heart rate control is advised. Personally, for a heart rate control, I'll suggest in each and every patient when it comes to the clinic or the Apollo hospital, I'll ask the patient if the heart rate is very high to start a ivabradine instead of a beta blocker. Instead of a beta blocker, I will ask him to start ivabradine 48 hours before the procedure, so that his heart rate is very well controlled. He didn't have to take a reappointment, because generally they give the reappointment to come after 2 days after a heart rate control. So I generally ask the patient to take a ivabradine for 48 hours.
Sir, what you said your cutoff for doing CT angio is 1.5, but I am sure you must be calculating the EGFR. What is your cutoff EGFR?
Sir, if we take it for the EGFR, it's 45 and less.
You don't do CT angio. Okay.
Because CT angio will require a good amount of contrast.
Right. Sir, sir, last question. In patients with diabetes where you do CT angio, even with a creatinine of less than 1.5, have you seen patients deteriorating kidney-wise?
I haven't seen, sir. If we do the good hydration of the patient, we give N-acetylcysteine and maintain the hydration till 48 hours after the CT angiography.
Sir, what is the dose of N-acetylcysteine that you give?
Like we load it with the 1200 milligram, and then
Two tablets.
2 tablets, then 1 tablet twice daily.
For how many days?
2 days before and 2 days after.
And then you stop it.
Yeah.
All right.
After 2 days, we repeat a KFT. After 2 days, we repeat a KFT because the chances of nephropathy is maximum after 2 days.
Dr. Batra, what are the indications for polylithotomy and not cholecystectomy? Where do you just remove the gallstones and you do not go for cholecystectomy?
So patients who cannot undergo surgery, those who cannot undertake full-fledged GA for a long period of time.
Sir, Dr. Amish Vora, our oncologist, he has a question.
Sir, for cardiology, 2 questions, sir. I listened to entire your lecture, but I was not listening to question answers. If you have already covered, then it's okay. One is, instead of discussing which patients are for CT and which for conventional, isn't it wise that weed out certain patients who do not require conventional through CT, so that you do not necessarily clog the angiography rooms with the patients who do not require conventional? If that can be one of the ways of screening patients for conventional, I think that is where the world is coming to. Second thing is, I see a lot of trend in young COVID survivors going for CT angio. I couldn't find any data and literature to support that, because I'm worried about the negative predictive value of CT rather than the positive predictive value. What are your thoughts on this?
Sir, I have mentioned in my slide that CT angiography can never be used as a screening tool. Otherwise, it will make a chaos in the society. If we check each and every patient above the age of 30 years who is having an atypical chest pain and sending him for the CT angiography, we will surely pick up so many false positives in CT because of the artifacts, because of the low mild disease or other bending artifacts in the, and all those patients will be put on the statins, all those patients will be made to have the lifestyle changes and all other things which are not necessary for those patients. So CT angiography is not a screening tool for an invasive angiography, first of all. Second question is the COVID positive patients. In most of the COVID positive patients, especially in the young age group, we in Apollo didn't find actually any blockages in the coronary artery. It's the clot formation only, rather than the blockage. So the CT didn't have any role in that context to detect those patients in which there is a clot formation or not, because that those patients present as an acute coronary syndrome. And acute coronary syndrome, the only indication is to go for the invasive angiography.
Thank you, Dr. Sir, if you permit me, can I ask a small question? Sir, Dr. Batra. Dr. Batra, I had one patient day before yesterday who was supposed to go get an endoscopy done. And ENT doctor said that we can do a small tube pass from the nasal side and do endoscopy. And it was done, and whatever results were there, it is okay. But what is your opinion about this?
So the ENT tube does not go beyond the larynx, it is the upper. They have done it, they should not be done, because it is the same as a pediatric or a ultra thin scope. So no, it can be done. I mean,
what he is saying is it should not be done.
It should not be done, but the reverse is also true. I mean, on flexible endoscopy, we see the larynx much better than the ENT, honestly.
Sir, thank you very much. We will come to the end of today's talk.